So, Alice, nice to meet you. As I was saying before, it was very nice for me to read your book now, because I've been to some of the places that you went. So I traveled along with you, and then I remembered also my travels in some of those places, especially in Pakistan and Amritsar, and and parts of Afghanistan as well. So you speak Urdu, and I would like to know, how did you decide to study that language, and what had drawn you to that part of the world?
So I went after university. I worked in Delhi in India, and I began learning Hindi then, because it's the national language of India, and it's the same language and different vocabulary, but different script as the national language of Pakistan, which is Urdu. So it was really natural when I then began traveling in Pakistan to carry on learning Urdu. And a lot of my vocabulary was kind of North Indian, but that didn't matter. And I had the idea to write the book when I was living and working in Delhi as a journalist for Indian newspapers and magazines. And it was very, like, as I described in the book, it was kind of one really, really hot evening where the kind of heat I just wasn't used to from having grown up in Britain. And I really loved it, actually. The sweat and I didn't have any air conditioning or anything, and I was in this tiny rooftop flat, and I was reading the newspaper, and there was a story about the Indus, and I suddenly thought about this amazing, huge river, which is mostly now in Pakistan and not actually, even though the name sounds like it should be in India. Of course, it was once in India, and parts of it still are in India, but the kind of puzzle of that river crossing all these borders and going through this immense amount of history and territory and uniting and disuniting peoples was such an allure that I then began this plan to go back to London and study at SOAS for an MA in South Asian history, and then to start traveling in Pakistan. And that was the start of this really, really great adventure.
How long did you travel?
So I first went to Pakistan, I suppose 1, 2, 3, 4 years, kind of coming and going, because it's a really long river. You
didn't travel all the way through. You went. Oh, okay.
I think my visa the various visas wouldn't have lasted. My visa in Tibet was really short. It was just a month. I had really nice visas in Pakistan, but I also kind of wanted to fill my head with all the history for each chapter, or a couple of chapters, and kind of steep myself in the history, and then go to those places, to the landscape that I was describing historically and would then describe in modern day terms. And there was just too much history to do the whole journey in one go. I would have got completely confused and flummoxed. So I did it in bits. I came and went. And that was really good, actually. That was a really nice way of doing it.
Yeah, I was going to ask exactly that. How did you do the research, and did you keep a journal along the travel? How was the writing process?
Yes, so I had these notebooks. I used to buy notebooks wherever I went in Pakistan. They make really nice notebooks with kind of lovely paper, and I had a pen, and I would write notebooks, fill up notebooks, and then I would return to London, and I would copy out the notebooks. And because each chapter is a mixture of history, but it's also history and the contemporary journey that I'm making, and the contemporary politics and culture. So it's kind of a melding of these two things. And so the first course was transcribing what was in the notebooks and going through the interviews and the journeys that I'd done, but then winding that into the history. So I sat in the British Library and I wrote rough drafts of each chapter as I did the travel for the chapter. And then once I'd done, so I was going up the river, up the river, so from the mouth to the source. The mouth is at Karachi, going into the Arabian Sea, and the source is in Tibet. And so once I'd done the Tibet journey and I'd written that chapter, and I then had my 12 chapters, then I sat down with this draft, this rough draft, and kind of rewrote the book. And it was my first book. I've just handed in my fourth book. And amazingly, it kind of is harder and it gets easier in some ways. It was kind of the process of writing my fourth book, which is about Britain, which is a long journey through the islands of Britain. It was really, really slow, kind of slow uncovering of material. But the hand-in, which I just did, was so tranquil. I stayed up till 4 a.m, just finishing going through the notes, boom, 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 and then I handed in the book. And it was definitely my most tranquil hand-in, so I'm feeling proud of myself for tranquility. No, it's different with each book, really. And this book was, I kind of had all the time in the world because I was a young woman and I just had me and my book, and it was like I kind of entered a kind of. I write a bit in the book about the kind of states that people enter, kind of madness or kind of sacred trance, and I felt like I was a little bit in a trance with this book. I would have done anything for that book. I would have gone anywhere. I would have eaten anything or drunk anything or walked anywhere. Yeah. It was really
I know the feeling. Another thing that is really interesting about the book is that you start at the mouth of the book and then you go to the place where it comes out. I don't know the name in English for that.
The source. Yeah, the source.
Yeah, the source. Yeah, of course, the source. And for me, the end was extremely. It was a big surprise, for me. It's like the plot twist. I'm not gonna say it because I don't know if people have read the book, but for me, the end was like boom, and I thought it was very curious for you to choose that path, that direction. That was something that you chose because of the practicabilities of the visa. And how was that? Was that on purpose, or was it because of the practical things that happened?
No, it was really. I wanted to discover the river, and the easy place to start was at the mouth, where there's a big city. I flew into Karachi, and that was my first point of contact with the Indus. And I knew that I wanted to. By the time I got to the source, I wanted to have traveled through all this history and this territory, and there to be a kind of purity of my encounter with the river at its beginning. When it bubbles out of the earth, I wanted to have earned the right to see it, I suppose, in that way. And it really became like a kind of pilgrimage. I'm not a religious person, but it became some form of pilgrimage through the landscape and through water and through time and through different cultures and religions. And I guess there's a kind of stripping away when you're in a mountain landscape, especially Tibet, which I'd never been anywhere so big, and in many ways so frightening. And I think, it was really the culmination. So it was an artistic decision, but and an emotional decision, and then the history and the politics and the culture kind of followed that path. And it's really interesting writing about a river. It's so satisfying writing about a river, because it's an obvious journey. It's such an obvious journey, and wherever it's a big amount of history, and it's a big amount of geography, and it's a complicated politics. But there was always that river at the center of my journey and of my thoughts, and indeed of the country I was passing through was this river, and it was such a solace. I can't really describe it. I really advise it as a form of travel and as a form of research. An inquiry, as a quest. To write about a river is a really wonderful thing. Yeah.
I was gonna ask why the Indus, because there's a lot of you talk about this a little bit on the book, because there is the Ganga River, there is the Nile River that is like the Amazon. Yes. but the Nile has a lot of history of explorers trying to find its source. So, what did attract you for the Indus? And I'd like to know, what is your relationship to the river now, and if you go back to visit it?
Well, funnily enough, I was just invited this morning to go in February. I don't know if I can, but the Indus. I mean, I was in Delhi, and it was very, very difficult to get to Pakistan from Delhi, from India. That kind of thing comes and goes. There are moments of opening up, and then there's closing down, and it was really interesting to me that I was working as a journalist. I worked for a moment for a travel magazine, and we even planned a Pakistan issue for this travel magazine. But there was no way that was going to happen, because no one was going to go from India to Pakistan. There's a lot more kind of yearning the other way. When I got to Pakistan, there were lots of people I met who had come, whose families had come from India at partition, and who remembered villages and remembered landscapes and remembered sacred trees. And, there's a lot of kind of looking towards India in terms of cinema and fashion and things like that in Pakistan. But really, it was this kind of iron curtain between the two countries. And I suppose something kind of, if you're presented with a barrier, it's really interesting then to climb over it, isn't it? If there's no barrier, then it's not so alluring. There was something, immediately it was like a puzzle and I was lucky. With hindsight, I was really lucky, because I was able to travel between these two countries, and even to go to Tibet and go to Afghanistan, and I was in a lucky position. Also, as a woman, I think I was really lucky to be a woman, because I didn't really present as a threat to many people, and I could meet men, and I could meet women, even women who normally didn't meet outsiders, and sometimes I felt like I was kind of neither. I didn't have a gender. I was just a kind of strange traveler. So definitely the desire to visit the Indus was partly about its divided history, the irony of its name, and India keeping the name, and Pakistan, which is mostly the Indus, taking a new name, but also just the river itself, this great river that is one of the most important early rivers of ancient Sanskrit thought, and then its kind of status changes way before partition, as the kind of Sanskrit culture moves into central India. The Indus is kind of loses its importance, and that was really interesting to me. Also, was how things, especially natural phenomena, how their status changes throughout history. And I love looking. It's so easy and I'm sure it's the same in Brazil. You're in Brazil, are you right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting looking really far back in time and looking at how things change and how things stay the same, and the Indus was perfect for that exploration.
Mm-hmm. There is a part of your book which I think in the middle, where you talk a lot. I think it's the longest chapter, I guess, on Alexander the Great.
Oh, yes.
And you start and the people start calling you the Alexander the Great, the girl in skirts. I don't know in English how was that. And you talk a lot about the idea of not seeing as an imperialistic traveler. You don't want to be mixed up with Alexander Burns, which was this traveler, 19th century traveler, working for the British Empire. I studied some of those travelers. I studied actually Richard Francis Burton, so I mean, I read a lot about those travelers. So, and that time, and I would like to know what do you think about. Because when I travel to those places, and I always think about if how not to be imperialistic in that way. You know, of course, we're not working for any big state, but we know we're foreigners. We go there. Sometimes I identified with, I related with a lot of the things that you said, you know, with the feeling, you know, that sometimes you just want to go and see things for yourself. You just want to feel the things for yourself. But at the same time, the act of watching the vision of anything, it's not a passive thing. It's an action. So I'd like to know, how do you work internally with that, you know? Because it's a big question for me, and I'm always asking myself that, actually.
Even when you're traveling within Brazil, or when you leave your
country? Even in traveling Brazil, because I'm from São Paulo and I'm a white woman, and so this is the richest city. And when I go, we have like a colonial relationship towards other parts of the country. So, and I know, and there are a lot of people from my city who go to other places and create this predatory tourism. I'm not, so I think it's that kind of posture and respect for the other, you know, I just always think about that. So I'd like to know, how do you feel about that? Do you still think about it? How do you relate to that?
Yeah, well, it is really interesting, and it's so different, isn't it, depending on where you are, and you know, for me in India, you know, I worked in India for 2.5 years or something, for Indian magazines. So I was writing for Indian readerships. And that was really important for me, I think, as a base, because that was my kind of, that was my gold standard, was to write something that people along the banks of the Indus would want to read. And I was kind of writing for them before I was writing for my audience in Britain or anywhere else. And that was my training. That was where I learned to write, I think, was being in Delhi, writing articles for newspapers, for magazines, for this travel magazine I work for, and learning the language, and you know. But I always looked very foreign in India, or inevitably. Whereas in Pakistan, it was. I definitely was, you know, there was a funny moment I describe in the book where I'm completely covered up in a kind of headscarf and I don't know, I'm, you know, dressed just like a Pakistani woman. And in my face, I don't necessarily look, because people are kind of fair in the north. I don't necessarily look as foreign as maybe I do in India, but my whole bearing was wrong. I think the man said to me, I knew you by your apka chelse, which means the way you walk, your gait. In English, we say gait. Basically, I walked in the wrong way for a Pakistani woman. And so there were nuances like that, but that was how I was received kind of externally. I knew, and this kind of touches on your question, kind of more personally, I knew that as soon as I finished this project, I had this sense that I needed to go back to Britain, where I'm from, and write about Britain next, because I just felt like kind of I needed that balance. I needed to see if it was possible for me to write about somewhere I was supposedly native to, or whether I would only be able to write about places that I wasn't native to, because it's so useful being somewhere as a foreigner, in that you ask questions all the time. You don't take anything for granted, because everything is new, and therefore you question absolutely everything. And it's through the questions, as you know, that you find out the answers. And I was really uncertain about whether it was possible to return to Britain and to use those same eyes to inquire about things that I supposedly knew very well, because they were where I was from. And it is really difficult. It's really hard. It's, you know, I've probably been kind of, it's taken longer, and I've been shyer about asking questions in Britain than I was in Pakistan or India or Afghanistan or Tibet. But it has been really, really rewarding to come home and use that way of being in the world that I learnt along the banks of the Indus to use it in this local context. And I think it's probably a matter of sensibility and respect and all these obvious things. And also an awareness that this history runs really deep, the history of imperialism. We haven't erased it in any manner of speaking in Britain. It's all around us in kind of standard British attitudes to the rest of the world. And it's a really interesting thing to study and to observe and to be really, really aware of. And I guess all you can do is carry that awareness with you and acknowledge that you're always learning. I think we're always learning about our own prejudices and our own assumptions and our own there's always something there's always something that we can see differently, I think, probably.
Mm-hmm. When I went to Asia the first time, I went to China first, and then I traveled around Pakistan, India, Nepal, Iran, and Turkey. And when I went to China, it opened my eyes to that, I don't know, my own bigotry or something, because people there, they asked, when I said I was from Brazil, they said, oh, it's the place where there's that statue of the man with the arms open. And I was like, oh my God, they don't know what Christ is, or Jesus Christ. So it was it was very, that was my first shock, my cultural shock, if I can say that. And then it kept going, and it made, and I discovered a lot of myself and a lot about the world. And I would like to know, in that traveling through India, through the Indus, what did you discover more about the world and yourself as well, if it had that? Because we're always discovering something, I guess.
Yeah, I think I discovered that it's really important to give people time. People gave me so much time, and they took their time to explain things, and they took time off what they were doing to take me places. And I really try and give people back time now. I hadn't, in Britain, where everyone's always thinking that they're so pressed for time, and in a way it's true, but that's kind of our choice, our cultural choice. And I think it's really interesting encountering different concepts of time, not just the kind of huge expanse of time that you find in a place like the Indus, where the culture's just, you think you've come to kind of gone far back in terms of the sophistication of culture as you can, and then there's another iteration which precedes that. But also the kind of daily interaction with people. And I think I learned that I just love learning. I love traveling. I really love traveling. I really want to go to South America next. I have a book I want to write about Peru and Chile.
You've been here before?
No,
South America?
No. Spanish. And I would love to go to Brazil, but this is a whole. I don't know why I take on these. I'm that's going to be the next project is going to South America. I have a really good story that I'm going to tell about the 19th century. Yeah, I began doing the research just a month ago. So it's I'll tell you about it when I begin. But yeah, I think I learned that there's, well, I again, like you, I was brought up a Catholic, and I loved going to India and encountering these goddesses who were so unlike the Virgin Mary. I went to a convent in London, and I used to go up the stairs at age 6, past this statue of the Virgin Mary with her veil on and looking her eyes down. And then I got to India, and the Kali is like this, with blood all down her, and it was amazing. Yeah, but that was the whole re-education was going to India and learning a different way of being as a woman, and a different kind of all these, the different sense of time and the different sense of history and politics, and you know, I just had my education. I'd had my whole basis of my British education, and it all was just blown out of the water by India. It was amazing.
Yeah, India is challenging. India is.
Yeah.
I gave up understanding India. I was like, I read about it, but I'm like, I give up. When I went there, I said, I give up. Let's just go and see where it goes.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to say that, because we have a lot of prejudice views about Islamic societies, and even Indian societies, you know, inside.
Yeah.
And sometimes we say that women, not me, but you know, that women are oppressed, and we need to bring feminism to free them and stuff like that. And then sometimes we hear them saying that, not all of them, but that feminism is like an imperialistic form of control as well. Did you encounter that sort of things when you travel? Do you think about that as well, or that doesn't really matter? Because it's interesting to be a woman in Islamic countries, because I felt like that. This third gender, or like another travel writer, Erika Fatland from Norway, she writes about in another book from Aine, Sovjetistan, that she was like an honorary man at some places, because she was accepted by the man and the women. Anyway, so I'd like. So, did you think about those issues, or that's not?
I mean, kind of. It is religious, obviously, but it's also cultural, because there are women in Pakistan who, when they're living in their village in, I don't know, in Western Pakistan, are wearing a burqa, and then when they go to Islamabad to see their cousins, they take it off and they just don't even wear a headscarf. And so everything is shifting all the time, even within a religion and within a culture. It depends where you are and who you're seeing and who you're talking to. And it was one of the interesting things, to go back to what we were saying at the beginning about journeying upstream and through all these, all these different Muslim cultures, was to see how they changed. In the mountains, they were much freer. And I got to Hunza, and you may have gone there from, which borders China, in the very north of Pakistan. And suddenly
I went to Sost.
Yeah. And suddenly female literacy is through the roof. Women are reading, and they're going to university in Karachi, and this is the same country. It's the same, ostensibly the same. I mean, it's the same religion. It's just a different form of it, and it has different values. So it was really interesting to see how the nuances. But the really striking thing was then going to Buddhist Ladakh in India and Buddhist Tibet, and seeing a completely different, way more emancipated, apparently, form of kind of society than we have in the West, and also one that harked back to these ancient ideas of female lands in, of places where, and a lot of the emphasis is on how many partners these women have, how many husbands, and it was kind of the flip side of Muslim culture, where the man is taking more than one woman, as you know, has more than one wife. And I was suddenly seeing this, and it really did make a difference. It was a qualitative difference. You could feel it in how women spoke to you, and how the interactions went. And you know, you would go somewhere in, say, Ladakh or in Tibet, and it wouldn't be a man who opened his mouth and spoke to you. And that was a really, really useful lesson for when I then began writing about Britain, because I kind of had a crisis in the middle of my kind of 2 or 3 years into this book that I've just handed in so tranquilly, which is called The Britannias. And I realized that this book about Britain, which is about islands, Britain told through its islands, I was just always interviewing men in Britain. would go to an island, and the 5 people who stood up to talk to me were always men. And then I was looking at the history, and it was all these Roman soldiers, and it was these Christian monks, and I just got completely overwhelmed and absolutely sick. And the one light for me was remembering traveling along the Indus and going through all these patriarchal cultures, and finally getting to Ladakh, and then getting to Tibet, and finding that there was a truth in what these ancient texts had said, where they described this land of women, that it really did exist, and that there was and that there was a form of social conduct and social organization that was completely different from anything patriarchal, from anything in Britain, from anything in Pakistan, in anything in mainland, the mainstream of India. And it was possible to rearrange society, and it was possible to, it really, really makes a difference what you do, how you arrange your culture, how you see the world. There's no point being apathetic. It really, really makes a difference. And that was amazing. And that kind of drew me through this crisis I had in my British writing. And I finally knew. I said to myself, you've seen it in India. You've seen these stories about women. It has to exist in Britain. And once I told myself that, then I found it. But I had to. It's a way of looking, and it's a way of seeing and inquiring and searching and not giving up. And that was probably the most important lesson to have learned of all.
Okay, so thank you very much, Alice. I think our time is up.
Yes.
I hope that if you come to South America or to Brazil, you can write me. You can write to me. Because I think we have a lot in common. We have a lot in common. I can tell you that. And so thank you very much, Aine, for the invitation. Thank you, Alice, and for everyone who's watching.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Bye. Bye.